Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to view Wolfpack Season 1, Episode 1. So, we have, in the very beginning of the intro of this show, we have a MTV logo that comes across the screen. And I'm like, oh, okay, so the people that brought you Teen Wolf wanted another bite of the werewolf apple, and so they brought together Wolfpack. So, this show, of course, was adapted from a novel, and while watching this first episode, I'm like, I'm not surprised by that. Because MTV goes on and just kind of, like, copies and pastes from stuff. Like, MTV rarely has anything that's actually original programming, hence why you would see so many reality shows and stuff like that for MTV, because MTV has just gotten lazy over time. But so we have Wolfpack that is to bring you more of a disaster show than it does a werewolf show. And plus, also, like, the one thing that it should have done and didn't in this first episode was to give you a werewolf transformation, because that could go on and make or break a werewolf show. To give us at a point when we could see like a transformation like the Teen Wolf show, and that was like, oh, okay, like I could be won over by this show. Or we could also get a transformation that's more like Twilight or like the Laura Vandervoort show, Bitten, which in all honesty I was really turned off by because like, man, like werewolves are cool for me. I love all kinds of movies and shows of them. But yeah, but like there always is to be that kind of make or break moment of a werewolf transformation, and we didn't even get that in this first episode. We do actually have a werewolf in this show that is to be during the day and night, so I'm assuming it's one of these case scenarios where we have a werewolf that is to always be werewolf, and that, of course, is to be rare, but there's certain times where certain stories would give us that. Like, being human at some point in the later seasons, for when I would watch the United States version, we would have, like, the werewolf, like, during the day, and we would have Aiden who'd have to kind of take care of Josh during that time of transformation while he's being a werewolf, more so than he ever was. So, for this first episode, I'm going to kind of tee it up, but I want to tell everybody, like, my clear thoughts about this show. So, I feel like this show does have a CGI budget, but I think they spend it on the wrong things. Because this is also a show that doesn't focus on the werewolf part enough. We have me, like, the later the show goes on, I'm like, okay, this is fairly predictable. And so, when going into the grading of this, I feel that this show is bad, and it is a hard bad, but I'm still intrigued by the show. We at least did have, like, Sarah Michelle Gellar show up in this first episode, because I'm like, yeah, this should really be the selling point to have Michelle Gellar or Sarah Michelle Gellar in most of these episodes, because no one else is going to come to this show because of any of these other actors, in all honesty. But I could really be wrong. Because if you got a good looking cast, then maybe that could change, but still. So, we have me now want to go on and kind of tee up this episode. So what happens? And then we'll get into the actual spoilers and talk about all of it. So, in this first episode, we have this forest fire, because only you can prevent forest fires. And we have this to be so widespread that it's affecting this town, having schools being canceled, needing to, of course, have certain portions of this town get evacuated, and this is to supposedly be the worst forest fire in 18 years, because I guess they've had a forest fire in the past, but I guess they've kind of just been lackadaisical and just letting another one happen. Come to find out within this episode, we'll know that this fire was to be an arson and that it wasn't just some weird accident of sorts. So we have both Everett and Blake, who are to be on this bus kind of going to school as if it's a normal day to them. And they slowly but surely start to realize that, like, well, hey, since school is canceled, like, we're going to go on and just go back on home. And come to find out, we'll have a stampede of animals coming through this forest, which is the big, really cool part of this episode. But then after that, like, we just have to go into a bunch of dialogue and just a lot of times where I'm like, oh, okay, like, we're giving some Teen Wolf kind of moments here, and we're going on and kind of having to figure out, like, why this show is going to be a big thing by the end of this. But anyways, so we also have Harlan and Luna, who are to be the nightclub kids. And once we kind of get to the nightclub thing, I was like, yeah, like, this feels just like a novel. Because we have to have some rave or nightclub in every single thing of a novel, like a game or show or movie or whatever. There always has to be that moment. So when Luna and Harlan finally meet up in this nightclub, we start to find out who they are. That it seems that instead of these characters being the next to get infected by at some point becoming a werewolf, we find out that these characters already are werewolves. And that we get flashbacks of how they've come to be. And so that leads these two characters to need to desperately find their father. I say father because, of course, they actually have a real dad who they possibly think could be a werewolf that is coming after them. So we have Sarah Michelle Gellar's character, and I have to explain who she is so that way people could maybe be interested or not be interested at all, because Sarah Michelle Gellar could be a big selling point for people. Come to find out, she is a LA Fire Department investigator. And so she is to immediately figure out that this is to be a arson case. And so she wants to try and seek out people who were on that bus or on that freeway to have her possibly figure out who could be the one to have caused this forest fire. And Sarah Michelle Gellar states that it has to be a teenager. It could have been a student. It could have been a friend of Everett's. And so, like, we really want to see where this story goes, because it's the whole mystery angle, and that's how you could possibly get somebody intrigued by this show. But I was kind of like, okay, like, again, you're focusing so much on the disaster part. Like, I would have liked it if we would have just magically found out that, like, oh, Sarah Michelle Gellar is a werewolf herself. But I'm assuming that the four characters are just going to be the werewolves. And we have at some point where we, by the end of the show, have to have the four characters unite together and realize that they are all werewolves. And like, realize, like, where they're going to head next and how they're probably going to need to rely on one another. So We also have a werewolf that is trying to track and hunt down these four werewolves. And that is to be this kind of big werewolf like character. And they really did not do this werewolf good at all. Like, you end up seeing the werewolf from this kind of smoke like shadow kind of backing up, which I thought was a stupid idea. We had one scene where we see like the big werewolf as a shadow, and so they really are telling us that we're not going to get much of like the werewolf and person like being in one scene together, because like they just don't have that kind of money. They don't have that CGI kind of money. So we have quite a bit of times in this first episode where people are like running away from the werewolf when it actually does show up. And we have the, of course, goofy moment of a character finding out that they seemingly have this strength or these six-pack abs, which immediately would tell me that this is coming off very much like the Christina Ricci movie Cursed, or is to feel like Teen Wolf the show, or is to come off like Power Rangers 2017 with the whole like them finding out like, oh, my hand, oh, wow. That whole goofy moment where we have the person punching the piece of wood and he's like, oh, my hand, it did a new thing, my hand. Really, you could also rationalize that as like, well, hey, like when there is like a moment of emergency where you have the woman who could bizarrely lift the van over her head or whichever to protect these kids. Like, we have that kind of adrenaline rush emergency moment of sorts, or whatever that story was with the whole woman who could kind of lift like a certain amount of weight to protect the kids. But yeah, with that said, let's go on into spoilers, because I've kind of talked about the ins and outs of most of this episode. So let's get more in depth and let's go into that double 5-time opportunity. So if I haven't said already, this show is available on Paramount Plus, but it's also available on an app called Culnisgol. Culnissgol. Culnisgol. You can watch this first episode for free and see if you're interested or not. There was a cool moment, which was that stampede thing. And I was like, oh my God, like there's some brutal things. I was like, man, like Teen Wolf, I don't remember gets this dark, but like for how brief that was, we then also have like the Everett scene where he's in the hospital. I'm like, why did they even do that? The whole like werewolf hand thing, that was just like, uh, um, but again, a show that has poor CGI at certain points. So, with that said, let's just go into what, of course, is to be spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time we get to spoil this episode. In the beginning of it, we have Park Ranger Garrick that is driving his truck. That says Park Ranger off to the side to let you know who this guy is. And so Garrett gets out of his truck to then notice this forest fire. And so then we transition to have Everett being on this school bus talking to his therapist. And I'm like, man, this is a really like personal conversation that he's having on a bus. And like, would I want to go on and talk about these really personal things on a bus? No. I don't want other people to overhear, especially people who I'm probably going to spend a number of hours with at school. That's just me. That's just my personal preference. But so, we have Everett who is talking to Dr. Whelan about taking another Ativan. And we, of course, have the doctor that's, well, like, have you tried your breathing exercises? Have you tried to like meditate and all these other things, and we have Everett that's, well, yeah, but it still feels like something's kind of like crushing me from within, and I would just like to take another like Ativan. Could I take half of one or something like that to just kind of calm me down? And so we all of a sudden have Dr. Whelan who is talking to Everett about like, well, hey, like did you know that there is like forest fires like around your area? Like, are you to be in danger at all? And so we have Everett that starts to look outside the opposite window of which that he is in and starts to notice these forest fires and needs to end the conversation with his therapist. So we have Everett and all the other students that go on one side of this bus to look out these windows to see how bad this forest fire is. The bus driver goes on and tells them, like, hey guys, like, you can't be like in the middle of the aisles, and you like, hey, sit back down. So we have the kids all of a sudden start to notice that I guess traffic is so bad that people are even starting to leave their cars. And so Everett starts talking to Blake about what's going on out there, and we all of a sudden have Everett starting to get some anxiety, which causes a psychogenic tremor, because he also mentions is like, well, I have this tremor because of anxiety, as he's again talking to Blake. So we all of a sudden have Everett who's getting a text, kind of like one of these like Amber Alerts, telling them that most of the classes are going to be closed or kind of shut down, and most of the schools that are around the fire are going to be closed. So Everett needs to tell Blake this because Blake does not have a phone, and Everett's telling Blake, it's like, how do you not have a phone? And Blake is like, well, it's my own personal choice. Like, some people don't have computers or laptops or like a social media presence or whatever. Like, I am just that person. So, and we come to find out through the rest of this episode, we have to play to the fact that Blake does not have a cell phone, so she can't be contacted. Or it just kind of plays to the fact of, like, the story has to really hold on to Blake not having a phone. So at some point, I'm assuming someone's probably going to give her, like, a burner phone and just like, well, we need to contact you, so here you go. Unless they figure out a way to just continue to write into the fact that, like, that Blake doesn't have a phone, and maybe Everett and Blake will just have to, like, be together at all times. I don't know. We'll figure something out, because it seems like they're going to be a couple within the show anyways. So we have one of the students, Austin, who is to mention that they are even evacuating certain areas. And so Blake asks for Phoebe's phone, a person that she does not like. And I'm immediately in my brain thinking, it's like, well, hey, like, if Everett was really nice to Blake, why not have, like, Blake just use Everett's phone instead of using another person's phone that, like, Phoebe would go on and state that she doesn't even like Blake, and, like, why would I give you my phone? But here is also another missed opportunity. So Austin wants to leave the bus and is recording the conversation that he is having with this bus driver to have as evidence that if he was to die in this situation, that he could blame the bus driver for not letting them leave this bus. And so Blake goes on and grabs Austin's phone and chucks it outside of the bus. And I'm like, here was another opportunity where Blake could have just taken Austin's phone, made a quick phone call, and then tossed the phone out of the bus. What happened there? So by the time that Austin gets out of the bus to retrieve his phone, we start to have a number of other students who decide, like, well, since like this bus isn't going anywhere anyways, and like we can't go to school because this school is closed, so we might as well just go on and make our way back home. So that all of a sudden leads to having these students find out that there is a stampede happening with all the deers and rams and all kinds of other animals that come out of the forest, specifically a werewolf, because of this forest fire. We will find out that people are to get attacked, and I was like, oh my god, when I was watching some of this. Because we have a ram that just rams into this woman into this car, and I was like, man, that was pretty crazy. We even have another point where an animal just, like, smashes into somebody's head to where their head caves in, and like, man, this is getting pretty brutal. So, we go on to have Austin that tells Everett that he needs to get back into the bus because there's something out. Everett notices Austin getting grabbed by something in the smoke. So, like, there's something out there. Yeah, of course you have to go on and have this moment where somebody's like, yeah, like, be worried, but then, like, you don't know what it is. So, we have Everett that is to see a large werewolf shadow off of one of these vehicles, and we next see Blake watching a kid like hitting this windshield of this car, and we have Blake that trips over a dead corpse. And so we all of a sudden see Everett, who just kind of falls out of the sky. He falls this way, and I'm like, okay, like, he obviously had just fallen from the sky. Because if he would have fell, like, this way, or if he would have fell, like, in an angle, then, like, I would be, like, okay, like, how he fell was to be as if he was tossed, but no, he just kind of falls from the sky, and I'm baffled by that. So Everett falls out of the sky, hitting onto this car on his way down, and Blake watches Everett because she sees him. She has like a viewpoint of him. So Everett will soon be almost crushed by this burning car coming his way. And so Blake, who realizes that Everett is just kind of, he's just kind of frozen, Blake grabs Everett and both of them start running together to dodge this car coming. And so we have them again kind of stopping, and Blake is telling Everett, it's like, run! Like, get out of here! Like, this is crazy! Like, people are dying. So we have both Blake and Everett who seem like... Everett at first, it looks like he has like a claw mark, but we'll find out that it's more of a bite. As if, like, the way that this kind of bite mark look kind of changes over time. But we obviously have Blake, who has like a bite mark in her back, and it kind of looked unusual to me. It's like, okay, so like the wolf would have had to have really like opened up its like its mouth to really bite down on this girl's back, or maybe it's a situation where like it looks like a bite mark at first, but then it looks like maybe a claw mark. It's very confusing. But so the more and more that like the bite mark and the things start to change. So when going further into this, so we have Everett that runs to see how far the fire has now spread, and he's starting to see these helicopters are dumping these chemicals called Fos check, which I had to go on and actually Google that up. Because I had gone on and seen like movies like Always or like a number of other kind of films and stuff like that where you would see these kind of like red chemicals like falling. There's like this one Angelina Jolie movie where it's like this forest fire kind of film. And so we have this chemical, this red chemical that gets dumped onto this fire to try to put it out. And so like we only have like one helicopter that we really see starting to do this. So I'm like, yeah, like that isn't going to be good enough. You need to bring in like a whole like lot of planes to just start dumping down on this. So Blake is to make her way through her neighborhood, and she gets scared by a dog who I believe its name is Diesel. And she goes from that to being cussed out by her father, who's a drunk. So it's like, yeah, really discipline your kids when like you're a drunk yourself. So Roberto is cussing Blake out simply because she was not here to take care of Danny instead of Robert doing that job, or really wanting like Blake to take care of Danny instead of Robert himself. But it's like, well, hey, like, how was Blake supposed to know that all this stuff was happening? She was just going to go to school like any normal day. But so we have Blake that talks to her brother, and while Roberto is trying to figure out where they're going to head next because shelters are starting to fill up and he doesn't want to have to pay for a hotel somewhere because he probably doesn't have the money. So like the further and further we find out, like Roberto doesn't even have enough money for like a tent for them to kind of be in because he's a drunk. So, and plus he's also going through a divorce. So Blake starts talking to Danny, and Danny sees that Blake's jacket is wet from the blood, and Blake then notices that she was bitten by something and is to run off to the bathroom to just kind of check herself, even though the bleeding technically had stopped. So Blake is to also start to look at her face, and we find that she is to have had like acne scars. And so Everett makes his way to the hospital as his vision is to be very blurry and is to be kind of off and on what he is to really see here. Whenever it is to finally make his way into this hospital, we have a nurse that comes to him. I'm like, I'm sorry, like normally hospitals don't really have that kind of convenience. Most of the time the patient has to go to the nurse to like, hey, like I'm checking in, like I have this wrong with me, instead of the nurse coming right to him. But again, this hospital might just be like way more convenient than any other hospital. So the nurse goes on to ask Everett, like, what is to be wrong with him, and he's like, oh, I have this animal bite. And so she's like, okay, well, what animal bit you? And he's like, well, I think it's a wolf. So we now go back to Blake's place where, like, Blake was kind of in this bathroom and she's to fall over. And so from, like, the wound or whatever that she was to go on and have. So Roberto is to honk the horn, and for Blake, it's like, come on, let's go. Like, we have to get ahead of everybody else trying to get some space for shelters and whatever. So Blake gets back out to find that Danny is missing. And so by the time that Blake finds Danny, Danny's looking out to this part of this neighborhood that he sees this werewolf that is bizarrely backing up more into this smoke. I'm like, yeah, because heaven forbid you can give us a werewolf right in this show that you can clearly see. So Danny and Blake get out of here to go into the car. And so Everett's in a hospital bed, and he is to hear this unusual breathing, thinking that some patient next to him is probably struggling for air. And when he does kind of move this sheet to see what's there, he finds out that there is a ram in a bed next to him that is pretty badly damaged. And then come to find out, we all of a sudden see this werewolf hand that is coming out of this ram's stomach. And I'm like, oh, okay, this is really just Teen Wolf for you. Because we would go on and have like the Teen Wolf characters that would have these hallucinations, and at certain points we would have like characters that are just kind of like barfing out this like black goop or whatever. And so yeah, like we get a lot of weird but cool hallucinations from our characters in Teen Wolf the show, and now we have to go on to do the same thing here. So if people are really interested in Teen Wolf show, check it out. I did like it. I probably only got so far with that, but that's just me. So the doctor comes in to Everett's kind of room, so to speak, because it's just kind of like there's a bunch of just like it's not an actual room, but the doctor comes next to Everett's bed, going on to have him say it's like, well, it looks like an animal bite, and telling Everett he was lucky and that the worst is over now. So the nurse is to ask Everett if he knew anybody who came here also other than Everett, and Everett, from what he can remember, said like, well, everybody just kind of ran off, but mentions Blake, and the nurse had mentioned that it's like, oh, well, like I called your parents, and Everett's like, no, like don't tell me you called my parents. And so the nurse is like, well, of course I did. So she goes off. We all of a sudden have Everett who gets this phone call. And so he starts telling the people out there, it's like, well, hey, like this phone is ringing. And so he decides to pick up the phone himself. Someone on the other line is to tell him to leave this hospital, and that something is tracking him, and to really hope that this guy is going to survive past the next full moon. So because this thing is going to come at him during the day or the night, but more so he should be worried about the night, because this thing could come out a lot more. So Everett's parents arrive, and by the time that Everett is to kind of like stand up in his bed, he all of a sudden passes out and falls over. And after looking at his arm, and his arm is just kind of red and unusual. So Blake asks how far the shelter is, and starts mentioning other suggestions, really just going on and having Blake state like, well, I have some money for a hotel, and like I know how much the hotel room is, and we have Robert that's like, well, how do you know how much a hotel room is? And Blake is like, well, there's two scenarios that go on and tie into that. Either I've gone on and slept with a man there before, or me and Danny had left to go to a hotel because you and Mom had been arguing for several hours, and we just left. You guys didn't even recognize that we were gone because Robert, of course, is a drunk, and so I guess he really didn't care because he was either drunk or he was hungover the following day. So we have Robert that's like, okay, I'll accept scenario one, that like you were sleeping with somebody at that hotel. So Blake decides to get some sleep, and she is to all of a sudden have this unusual dream that she and Everett are to have these werewolf like things, and Arch is going like going like a lot of that because of course, heaven forbid, we have these people transformed into actual werewolves. So that is the kind of the cheap way to do werewolf things, because if you've ever gone on and seen shows like Supernatural, where Supernatural never really had any money, they would go on and have to like get the closest they can to do a werewolf thing without actually doing one. Because they didn't have the money to do much of that. Like, if anything, a dragon would just be a guy with black eyes. It's goofy. So we have Everett that is to drink some water after feeling lightheaded, or something that had electrolytes in it. And so Everett's mother starts to complain about the severity of why Everett is even here. And Everett is to show her the bite mark that seems to have quickly more healed than it did look when we first saw it up close. So they're like, well, yeah, like that won't even leave a scratch or a scar. And so he's looking at it again, and he's like, oh my god, like this is way different than what it was. So Everett wants to leave before nightfall, and his parents are telling him that it is already nightfall, that they had given him a sedative when he had fallen over, and so yeah, like it is already nightfall. So Blake opens the door to the hotel room. Blake watches the news with Danny because we come to find out that since Danny has autism, that he has to go on and turn on a TV and go on to the news and so on and so forth. So Roberto is to try to call somebody. I'm assuming it might be like an insurance guy or something of that nature. I'm not really quite sure. He doesn't say who it is. So we have Roberto trying to figure out where to go next, and if his house is to burn down, like what are they going to do after that? And so there really is no answer. So we have Roberto who makes a suggestion at school. Hey, like you guys could probably end up at your mom's place, but how are we going to even get a hold of her? Because if Roberto is to call their mother, like more than likely they probably won't get a hold of her. But if Blake tries to call and Blake is like, well, how will my mother know that it's me? Because like I don't actually have a cell phone. And so Robert's like, yeah, right. And so it's, oh well. So we have Danny that is to notice that Blake's skin has like really cleared up and is to have healed. So we have Blake that rushes to the bathroom, and so Blake's bite mark is to really start to have this kind of weird, kind of reddish thing going about it, possibly having us realize that maybe this wound is healing or something of that nature. And so I think this is the moment where Blake does fall over in the bathroom, whereas before like Blake had just kind of run off to kind of get new clothes or whatever to kind of get ready for her to get out of here. So we have Blake and Everett that have this kind of weird psychic connection, because when Blake does get up, she sees Everett in this mirror in this hospital, and Everett is looking back at Blake. So we have this weird psychic connection between them, more than likely having us realize that they're probably going to end up together in the show, unless we find out that maybe somebody else is batting for the other team or whatever. So Blake is to try to leave this hotel room, and before she does, Roberto starts apologizing, stating that, like, well, yeah, I'm sorry about what all had happened, but, like, I really need you here. Like, I really need you to, like, help me out. And Blake is like, okay, yeah, like, you just are freaking so lazy that you want me to do something consistently for you, is really what it sounded like. So, but yeah, so Blake just leaves because, like, Blake can really realize now that, like, she can be on her own and she'll be fine. And that Blake also needs to find Everett because there seems to be something really going wrong with her. And she's hoping that Everett may have answers, or them two together can find someone who does have answers. So next we see Harland at this rave dancing methodically. Cause we have to have a rave. It's a novel show. So we all of a sudden have Harlan, who is to see from the roof of this nightclub. He sees this thing of ash that falls onto his hand, but then he just continues to keep on dancing because the ash falls from the ceiling, and so he's like, okay, what is this? So Harlan is to notice this DJ, who I believe actually has the name of DJ Asher, which is kind of ironic. And so Harland and this DJ keep looking at one another back and forth. They're like, yeah. And so I'm like, oh, okay, so Harland is to really be interested in guys, of course. And so we all of a sudden have Harlan notices that he's getting text messages consistently from Luna of like, well, where are you? Like, hey, I'm looking for Garrett and this and that and so on and so forth, or I'm looking for Dad. Because we'll find out that Harlan and Luna's father, stepdad, is to be Garrett, the park ranger that we saw at the very beginning of this show. So we don't have Harlan that answers, and he just continues to talk to the DJ, and they leave to go in another part of this rave to start making out. So Luna goes into this nightclub to quickly find Harlan making out with this guy. It seems that all of a sudden we start to like have Luna watching on as Harlan is to start to get de-pantsed and whatever for them to kind of go off and do whatever they're going to do here. And then all of a sudden, the DJ notices Luna is there. And so the DJ asks Harlan, it's like, well, do you know this person? And Harlan's like, well, yeah, she's my sister. We also had the DJ who was to go on and ask Harlan's age. And he was to say, it's like, well, yeah, like, I'm definitely not in high school or anything. Like, so come to find out, this guy is to be 18, roughly, from the flashback they explain in some point of the show. But so we have Luna that is to talk about Garrett to Harlan and talk about Garrett being missing. So we find out here that Garrett is to be their father, but Harlan is like, well, not really. Like, he's just our stepdad because he was the one who found us when we were young. So Harlan's hearing has much improved, even better than times of the full moon. And so we have Luna that's like, well, yeah, like me too. Like, I'm starting to like notice that things are much more heightened. And so it's like, okay, so that tells us that both of them are already werewolves where they don't have the growing pains that probably both Blake and Everett will probably have of their probably first transformation and a number of other things, because it'll probably hurt a lot the first time and then eventually it'll probably become easier later on. Or maybe it'll hurt every time, kind of like werewolf. Wolverine would state that every time the claws come out, like they hurt every time. So maybe at some point he should just kind of cut off his nerve endings and, and not have to deal with so much of this pain. But again, he would just have a healing factor, so like the nerves would just grow back. So back into this story. So we have Kristen, who's Sarah Michelle Gellar's character. I'm like, finally, we figure out what she's to be in the show. And so Kristen is with Officer Jason, going to this hospital, asking if there is anyone who came in here with any injuries on the freeway. And that was kind of around that kind of school bus and everything like that. So the nurse goes on and answers them with like, well, like, yeah, we did have like this one guy, Everett. And so Everett's parents are going on and talking about who Kristen really is and giving us some more backstory or explanation of who Kristen actually is. So I was like, okay, that's like a good thing that we have here. But as Everett's parents are bickering and even having suspicions that Everett could have been the arsonist to have caused this forest fire, because I guess these parents don't even trust their own kid. We have, of course, Everett, who is running out of his hospital bed, disconnecting his IVs, and just getting the heck out of there, looking at his phone for a school directory. So, going back to Blake, Blake is feeling like something is hounding her as she is running in this street, and so she starts running. And the further and further she starts running, we start to see her running really fast to the point of us like realizing, like, is she the Flash? Because it looks like she's like running like Clark Kent from Smallville, or like the Flash, and so like she's running so quick that it's like, is she gonna run back in time? So Blake goes back to her neighborhood again, because I guess there's only so many set pieces that we can go into in the show. And Blake is seeing cars and houses that are now on fire. And so we have Harlan and Luna that drive up to the forest to talk to Ranger Prisha. I'm hoping that's how that's pronounced. Prisha talks about the animal stampede and kind of reviewing what we've already kind of known about the situation. But so Patricia is to talk also that like Garrett could have just gotten caught up in all of that, and like maybe they will find him, and so like the situation looks a lot worse than it possibly really is. So to try, like, maybe the Ranger Patricia is to just try to calm them down. So Harlan asks what kind of animals were there, and that if there was a possibility that any one of them could have been a wolf. And we have Prisha that is to come to the conclusion. It's like, well, like, I could not really assume that there would be a wolf coming out of this forest. Uh, but even if there was one, like, there obviously would not have been an animal that could have been a wolf that could do a claw mark like we see on Garrett's truck. So Blake and Everett are to meet up at Blake's house. And so Harlan and Luna talk about the fire. Like, man, we're really like mixing it up here with all these scenes. So Harlan and Luna are talking about the fire and how this is the worst fire in 18 years. So Garrett had gone on to find Harlan and Luna as like little fox looking or little wolf cubs 18 years ago today. So we see Garrett that is to have much longer hair in this flashback and is to find these little wolf cubs like right underneath this little tree. And like we see like a wolf just kind of popping its head. It's like, nah, help. So we have Harlan and Luna worried about that this could lead to them finding their real dad, and they're worried about what that will lead. That like this real dad could maybe be this like killing machine. So it also might be the fact that it's looking for them. So Blake and Everett go inside her home, and Everett realizes that Blake will probably lose every bit of this house because it will burn down soon. And Blake doesn't really care. She's like, well, I think my brother would be a lot more concerned about losing this house than I would. And they talk about Blake's brother being autistic, and that Danny would have to go on and go into a room and find out that a TV is there, and he would have to turn it on and turn it on to the news. And Everett asked Blake, it's like, well, what happens if like he doesn't get to do that? Then Blake would kind of talk about the levels of like tantrums and screaming and even smacking himself. So Everett talks to Blake about like, well, hey, why didn't you go to the hospital? And that Everett also talked about when he went to the hospital that he had this kind of weird phone call that wanted him to leave. And so Blake goes on and tells Everett, it's like, well, I think you went to the wrong hospital. You should have gone to the psycho ward or the mental hospital instead of the regular hospital because you lost it. So they talk about the people who died and Everett's bite that is to kind of be now like drastically different than what it was again. But we also have Everett that notices when he takes off his shirt, he has 10 pounds of muscle that just grew within hours, which doesn't make rational sense. So we also have Everett who is talking about Blake's skin, how her skin was to have had acne scars, and now it seems to have all these scars be gone. So Everett and Blake all of a sudden see this wolf appear from this opening of this window and realize that the wolf is going to come into this house and break through. So we have this wolf come in, and we have the dog Diesel that tries to go on and attack this werewolf to try to save the kids. And we have Blake and Everett who try to run. We have Everett and Blake, who cannot get further into this house because of a wood piece blocking them. And so Everett needs to go on and punch this piece of wood, which all of a sudden he's like looking at his hand. He's like, oh my God, my hand. And Blake is like, run, dummy. So we now go back to Harlan and Luna, and they are trying to track down Garrett within this forest. And all they can smell is the fire or the smoke or the what. And so, yeah, so they're trying to figure out if they could, like, hear something or possibly smell something, and all they're smelling is the fire. So we have Garrett that is running around in this forest, and he takes out this kind of like little recording from his backpack and starts to make this message about both of his kids, because he probably realizes he's going to die soon, or maybe he's going to suffocate from all of this smoke. So he goes on to do this kind of heartfelt message, like talking to Luna and Harlan. Like, the one thing that I can remember is Harlan was to go with Garrett to see all these kind of rated R horror movies, even though Harlan wasn't old enough. But the funny thing of it is that Garrett had gotten more nightmares than Harlan did. And so really the heartfelt thing kind of ends with like, well, yeah, like, I know that I love you guys even though I'm not your real. And then he stops and he's like, no, I need to keep going on. So he puts back on his bandana and rushes back out to hopefully get out of this forest. So let me pause here. Immediately I want to apologize for how long this is taking. I know how lengthy the episode is. But so we have Blake and Everett that are freaking out about what they just saw. A big, massive werewolf that is trying to track and hunt them down. And so we have Blake that is starting to like hyperventilate, and she's like, I can't breathe. And so Everett's like, well, hey, how about we have some breathing exercises, and how about we start to do certain things that tie into yoga? And Blake's like, you want me to do yoga right now? And so he's like, no, like, let's just do this breathing exercise. And so she's like, oh, okay. So they both look at one another, and they both stick their tongue out like, ah. And they both do that, and it seems that both of them realize like how like funny and goofy that was. And so that got them to just like, okay, like, let's kind of calm down a little bit more. And so Blake even like suggests like maybe she should go on and do that with Danny, and maybe that'll help him a lot more with Danny's situation. So we have Blake that is wanting to just go back to her hotel room, and Everett's like, well, hey, that thing will track you down there. Isn't that a mistake? Like, should you not go on and like try to find a safer place? And Blake is like, this thing can't track me down. Like, come on, like, it's an animal, and like, you're thinking that it has like a vendetta against me or something. So we have Everett that all of a sudden gets a call from Kristen, and so Kristen wants Everett's help to track down who did this fire that she knows is arson. She had gotten something of evidence from this police officer, but like, oh, okay, like, someone had to have done this. So Kirsten is to say that the arsonist has to be a teenager, and so we, after like Kristen is to like talk and desperately want Everett's help to figure out who this could be, we then end this phone call without like Everett really talking to Kristen. But Kristen's like, well, I just like, even if you're not going to talk to me, I just want your help. So we all of a sudden have Blake, Everett, Luna, and Harland all roll their eyes in the back of their head. And they end up all going into this one location to find one another. And they find out that every single one of them are alike because they all have their eyes glow yellow. And this has never really happened before. And so, like, well, it must be the full moon, or it must be because of the moon. And so they really start to kind of just figure out that this was like a meant to be like situation. And so really that's how they kind of finish up this episode, with us realizing that our characters were like destined to have met here. And so with that said, I'm going to go on and try to get out of here to try to make this video as short as possible. Let me know in the comments below how you felt about Wolfpack, whether you liked the show, whether you thought it was way better than what I thought I was talking about, or whatever. Because at the end of the day, I'm going to say I'm going to get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.